Morning. Nate?
Oh!
There you go.
Are these poached eggs?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Mm. 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 Oh. Mm. 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 Oh, this is so good. I can't wait to see what you guys do next week. For Mother's Day?
When I was a boy, I played a lot of baseball. It was the only game boys could play in the summertime back then. It didn't matter how hot it got, I always was ready to field a few grounders and catch fly balls. I played Little League and Babe Ruth League baseball. I started playing league ball when I was 8 and kept at it until I was 14. I pitched and played shortstop on the days I wasn't allowed to pitch. As I got older, the game got harder. In Babe Ruth ball, 13-year-old kids were playing against 14 and 15-year-old kids. The age difference made a difference. I struggled some. I remember one of the coaches pulling me aside for one of those quiet talks coaches have with players and telling me that he was moving me down in the batting order. I knew that being moved down wasn't a good thing. It meant that you weren't a reliable hitter. He said, "We need you out there, but I'm going to move you down in the order until you get out of the hitting slump you're in." And once when Yogi Berra was asked about being in a slump, he told a reporter, "I'm not in a slump, I'm just not hitting the ball." Now I could have said something like Yogi said. I could have said, "Coach, don't feel bad, I'm not in a slump. I've been playing since I was 8 years old and I've never been much of a hitter. That said, other than trying to hit a fastball or a curve, a slider or a changeup, I'm just as good as the next guy. The truth is, I'm not in a slump. I'm in a rut and have been ever since I picked up a bat for the very first time. I've been in some serious kind of rut since then. You name it, I've probably been there. I might be in a spiritual rut right now. Sadly, if I think I am, I probably am. My Lori would say, now that you know what the problem is, what are you going to do about it? But it's not just me. I bet that we've all been in a spiritual rut at some time or the other. You might be in one right now, knowing the change you need to make, but circling the mountain instead. You know, ruts are usually long-term. Sadly, they get to feeling so much like normal that we begin to think they are normal. They begin as routine. Over time, routine gets to feeling pretty good. It becomes a comfort zone. Staying the same gets easier and easier. And before we know it, routine has slowly become a rut that keeps us from crossing over into the better place we'd like to be. My sermon today is drawn from the words found in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 3 and 13. Those verses read this way: "You've circled this mountain long enough. Now turn north, get moving, cross the Zered Brook." They were doing what they'd been doing for 38 years. The generation that had to die before God's people could go into the promised land was gone. Moses would be dead soon. That bad history, that rebellious history would be behind them. There was no need to keep circling the mountain any longer. You'd think that those left would have been excited about it. You'd think that those left would have been eager to finally leave the wilderness and move on out into the promised land. You'd think that those left would have been getting ready to cross over. They weren't even talking about it, as far as I can tell. Instead, the Lord, like a parent, finally had to say something. They kept circling the mountain until the Lord finally had to say, "You've circled this mountain long enough. They'd become complacent like we do sometimes. They were moving all the time, but they started to confuse motion with progress. We do that too, confuse motion with progress. We confuse the busyness of church with making progress. They were also living in the shadow of God's tent. Maybe they'd begun to confuse physical closeness with spiritual closeness. Kind of like we do when we start thinking that church going alone is enough. That said, church attendance is mighty important. I've heard folks say that Jesus doesn't care whether a person is in church on Sunday or not. And that's nonsense. In Luke 4, verse 16, we're told that as was his custom, Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. In Acts 17, verse 2, Luke wrote that as was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service. Their custom should be our custom too. When life gets back to normal and safe, it shouldn't be a when you feel like it kind of thing. It should be a whether you feel like it or not kind of thing. Even if you're really just coming for a cup of coffee or some fellowship or simply to fool people into believing that you're good, you being in church, even for the wrong reasons, might be an encouragement to someone else. So because they kept moving and were living in the shadow of the Lord's tent, they fooled themselves into believing everything was all right, that they were making some kind of progress. Instead, they were just spinning their wheels. They kept circling the mountain until the Lord finally had to say, "You've circled this mountain long enough." A.W. Tozer, the great preacher and author, wrote that God's people had become victims of routine, that they'd become satisfied with going in circles. They'd established a nice routine. Having a routine is nice until it becomes rote. By rote, R-O-T-E, I mean predictable but not meaningful. Tozer calls routine the greatest enemy of the church. Now some would argue that progressives are the greatest enemy of the church. Others would argue that it's the traditionalists. Some would argue that Democrats are the greatest enemy of the church. Others would argue that it's Republicans. Tozer argues that it's routine. By routine, he means the place where what has been determines what is, and what is determines what will be. Where sameness is confused with progress. Some of you know that place. Now God's people had let routine morph into a rut. They were drifting along, circling the mountain as if nothing were wrong and had been for 38 years. Fussing about where they were, but not thinking about where they could be. Routine had blinded them to the rut that they were in. By rut, I don't mean a slump. A slump is usually a short-term thing. A rut is long-term. A rut cuts deep over time. A rut is easy to get used to because it begins as mere routine. God's people had gotten used to theirs. So the good Lord woke them up. You've circled this mountain long enough. Now turn north, get moving, cross the Zered Brook. It's easy for us to fall into a rut like they did. Whether it's a church or a person. We get into a rut but kind of take it for granted after a while. It gets to feeling okay. We make peace with it. We get to feeling that what we are is what we ought to be. We forget about where we could be. Progress is put on hold. We get comfortable circling the mountain like we did last year and the year before and the year before that. We get to feeling self-satisfied. We get to feeling self-made. We get to feeling self-righteous. We get to believing that we've arrived. And when we get to feeling and believing like that, complacency sets in. Routine becomes the norm. Change becomes impossible. And our rut soon becomes our home. It happens to churches, and it happens to churches because it begins with people. You see, church people in a rut create churches that are in a rut too. Imagine what would happen if we stopped confusing the busyness of church with progress. Church going with holiness. Stop making excuses, got serious and said, I've circled this mountain long enough. I've settled for less too long. Time to step out in a new direction. Time to quit circling the mountain. Move out, cross over, and get to where the good Lord wants me to be. Maybe you've circled this mountain long enough. Maybe it's time for you to move out, for you to cross over and get closer to where the good Lord wants you to be. Amen.